I'm excited today to welcome Luke and Brittany from Centercode to talk to us a little bit about their journey in evolving to a remote first culture. Now, all of us got disrupted by the pandemic. All of us had to go home and work from there and make choices about what we're doing. But rather than just figuring out how to work from home or how to operate with team members at home, Centercode has actually really leaned in and chosen to be remote first and decided that that's going to be their primary from the outset. So we've been working with this team for the past year and observing the way that they have really taken a very intentional and proactive approach to how they run a remote first company and transition a culture under a whole bunch of different types of change. So I've asked them to join us today to talk to us a little bit about that journey and share with the audience really how they've done that, the good, the bad, the ugly. And hopefully we'll get some good and practical advice for everybody who's decided to join us. So I will let you guys introduce yourself.
Sure. So I am Brittany Traufler. I have been at Centercode for close to 10 years now, and I am currently the head of People Ops.
I am CEO and a founder of Centercode, although technically I founded it as CTO, so my background is more on the engineering product side, which I love, so definitely a sort of product-driven CEO in that sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, and thanks for spending some time with us. So I wanted to start just with a bit of description of the choice. We all got, sent home, all had to make the accommodations for working from home. But you made the specific choice, Luke, to turn the company into a remote first company.
Yeah, absolutely. So like everyone else, it initially was not a choice. We were shot an email that said you need to be off campus by 5 o'clock because they're locking the doors. We had one pretty large office space in a broader campus, so our property managers basically threw down the gauntlet. We went home, expected like everyone else to be home for a couple weeks. Months went by, and I started to get requests from a few people. At that point, everyone was pretty much based out of Southern California in this one significant office. And I started to get requests to spread out, specifically because this new lifestyle was very challenging for people in certain circumstances. So people that were in a small condo, because it's incredibly expensive in Southern California, but had kids, and suddenly both the husband and wife were working from home with the kids, blah, blah, blah. They just sort of came to the realization that frankly, they probably would have came to eventually anyway, which is it would be cheaper, more efficient, and their quality of life would go up if they moved elsewhere. So within just a couple months, we gave the okay, sort of as an experiment, a trial, to have a few people move out of state. At that time, of course, I had no idea what kind of pressure that was going to put on Brittany to deal with all the intricacies of employing people out of state. I'm sure we'll get back to that. But we did that, and it worked. And we made some changes. And, one thing that's interesting is in early pandemic, to those that remember, I do think everything worked pretty well if you were a tech company pretty rapidly. Like, we all had this immediate impression that, hey, this is fine. This is great. This is going to work out just fine. But the reality is we were all kind of on the back foot, defensive. Everyone was working harder because we were all just sort of trying to avoid thinking about the world. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that it was feasible, but it also became clear over time that this wasn't sustainable. So, short version is it started to feel like it worked without doing much at all. We initially started letting people go elsewhere. Shortly after, two other sort of revelations happened. One was that we very rapidly realized, hey, if people are already going elsewhere and it's improving their quality of life, we now can confidently hire elsewhere. And it started with, a couple people that for a very long time I had really wanted to work with. I wanted to be a part of our company. But for geographic reasons, it didn't make sense, especially when we were all in one place. The idea of having one or two people remote on the other side of the country would have been a pretty inhibitive challenge. So now we started bringing in those people, and that was phenomenal. It was just a huge win. Then we could open up the floodgates to effectively hire anywhere people we didn't know. So it went from I can take a few opportunities to get people that I've really wanted and have known for some time, to now we just sort of open the opportunity, aperture to everybody. So I, in an all hands, made the statement, which I'll admit I didn't plan, as is most of what I say in my all hands, but I basically said, look, if you're in your 20s or 30s and don't own a home yet in California and ever intend to, you should probably move. And the reality is a starter home in our neighborhood was a good $1 million plus. And the reality being that they were going to rent forever and rent was going up even faster than housing prices. So then we had a number of people start to take us up on that. And it just got to a point of inevitability where I didn't feel like we had a choice. And I definitely, while I don't think remote is perfect or ever will be, those pros vastly outweighed the cons. So it just kind of became a situation where I never once reasonably considered or even considered it for a moment, like, let's roll it all back. let's give up the people that we got that we love. Let's give up the new hires and or convince them to come here and pay twice as much to live. Like, it just was never an option. So it was all about rolling with the punches, which was always kind of innate to our culture anyway, that we just stuck with it and decided that this was the new future and that the advantages would outweigh the disadvantages.
So, Brittany, it sounds like you had some tactical things at the outset.
It's been quite a ride figuring out all the new states. But I think once you sort of figure out one or two, you start to get in a groove of like, here's the things that I need to dig into. I don't think it's an impossible challenge for a small company to tackle, but you have to put some rails on it every now and again.
Well, and then once you sort of realize that the bus has left the station, what are other things that started coming into your conversation about what you were worried about or things that you knew that you were going to have to kind of get ahead of?
Well, I would just say, like, from when the challenges started arising for us from like a work perspective, visibility of productivity was kind of, I think, one of our big challenges that we had. So I think we've all seen statistics of, managers think that their people are less effective. People think that they're more effective. And I think the reality is somewhere in between. And so we sort of had to figure out, how do we build this trust that is necessary in this kind of relationship? And how do we support that with tools also? I think that we have to create a world where we can understand what people are doing without being the micromanagers we don't want to be, and create that world for our employees to work in.
Yeah, and I like the way you express that. In one, it's about building the environment of trust, but also it's a perception battle. There's perception on both sides of what's going on, and it's hard to find that sort of stasis or so that reality where both parties can feel good about that productivity. Luke, you also talked about a culture that was very collaborative by nature, by the nature of the way you built your product, by the nature of the kind of product you have. But talk a little bit about how you, moved towards making sure you kept that as an essence of your culture.
Yeah, actually, I'll speak briefly to the way that I found you guys, and this just sort of occurred in the back of my brain how this all started. I was wrestling with literally everything. Everything was different, and I had to approach everything differently. The thing that got me, actually, and where this all started, and I initially had this conversation with Brendan, I don't know if he remembers this, but I was absolutely hating remote all-hands meetings. All-hands meetings were a big part of our culture because we were in one space, we were in one physical space. We often combined them with, the bar at the office and things like that. And it was just lost on me. I just hated being a talking head on a screen. I didn't have a format that worked. It wasn't as impactful to have my own sort of direct teams come up and talk. It just wasn't fun. It didn't add to our culture. So I did, what we all do is just started Googling ideas for remote all hands. I actually wasn't looking for anything that your tool directly did as sort of its core competencies when I found you. It was actually just that. I was looking for content on how to do an all hands in this new environment. I found a blog post. I, thought, what do these guys do? And it led me to a different solution, which was just all about general day-to-day collaboration as opposed to those all hands. And to me, that's something that I've always struggled with. I mentioned before we all got on this call that for me, I've always had a struggle of I've got so many meetings in a day, simply keeping up with them can be a challenge. And I forget so much. And in this remote environment where everything feels the same, that was getting even worse. So that immediately led me into this, okay, how do I not just make collaboration as a full team better, which maybe could be argued isn't that much collaboration in all hands, but how can the day-to-day get better? And providing more structure to things that just happened ambiently before suddenly became a new problem to solve. And that became number one for me. So it started with all hands. How do I convey important information to the team in a way that makes them feel connected to the product, feels them connected to myself, to what we're doing, to our customers? But then also, how do we continually collaborate in an ongoing fashion in something that didn't really need a different level of structure because we were all just in a room before? I would argue that even before it wasn't great, and reflecting on it really showed a lot of those gaps, but it got even worse in the remote environment.
Yeah, so almost the problem you didn't know you had until, salt got poured on that wound and everybody went home. And you're like, no, now I can't ignore that anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the, among the many things I sort of liked around your approach was you were going to try a whole bunch of things. And you were going to make sure that you were open with the team that this is to support, the continuing of a culture they already loved, and that this was part of what you were doing. One of the things that you did that I think others might stray from is the idea of moving to monthly goals. I think, Brittany, you shared sort of that inability to get a sense or sort of see productivity or understand pace and that kind of thing. I think a lot of what you read about remote work is that. How do you keep pace? How do you keep productivity? How do you keep sort of equity, that everybody's doing the work? So one of the things you guys did was monthly goals. That's something that you worked within our product, but I'd love to hear a little bit about sort of maybe the move to that, what was involved in actually getting that to happen. I think people struggle with goals at all, never mind a structure that requires the kind of commitment to monthly goals. So I'd love to hear both from like an implementation, but also just going through that cultural change around that.
What I can cover in part is why I was so passionate about moving to monthly goals was actually very tactical. You did address it well, but it really came down to, we saw and felt across the board an enormous amount of procrastination because, in part, your goals compete with a lot of other things. One thing that I think most people in the professional world and the tech world recognize is that if you're using something like OKRs, which we were always using our own sort of variant of OKRs, it never encapsulates all of your work. It encapsulates a fraction of it. And that fraction becomes very reportable, but everything else isn't. So we ran into this situation where we'd be into the last 2 weeks of a quarter, and most of the OKRs are somewhere between 0 and 25% done. And there's a good chance my team was still going to finish most of them, but there ended up being a couple problems. One, we had a constant anxiety that things weren't getting done, even if we knew that they likely would. And at the same time, it could force them into a crunch mode that they didn't plan well for, or, and it's sort of a negative for them. So the idea, one of the things that became obvious to me is we're going to need a faster cadence if we're going to keep on top of these things, and we're going to avoid procrastination while surfacing information better. So when we made the switch, I will say, one of the sort of tactical things I would advise on is we didn't try to create a situation where there were more goals or more to encompass, or it encompassed more of your workload. We didn't go with that at all. We used to have sort of a typical, you've got sort of 3 OKRs on average in a quarter. We went to the team and said, okay, we're not looking for 3 in a month. We're looking for 1 in a month. Take your quarter and spread it out. And that will be a starting point, and then we'll continue to evolve from there. And I will say we had some troubles with that. A lot of people, when they saw quarterly go to monthly, it wasn't that they thought we were working them harder. I think we have a transparent and positive culture for that not to be what the insinuation is or the assumption. It was just that their brains went from a quarter to a month without changing the workload. And all of a sudden we saw the first sets of monthly goals were just way too big. And it wasn't the, hey, if you multiply this by 3, it feels like a quarter. It was, no, if you multiply this 3, it probably feels like 2 to 3/4. And that's not going to be reasonable. You're going to fail. Everyone's going to be unhappy. Let's not do that. So the other change we went with there that was important is we moved away from, and I know this is sort of a core tenet and very divisive, but we were very much into the concept of OKR goals being aspirational, and the idea that you're setting a goal that you don't at that point in time know how you're going to achieve. And I always thought there was some really great ideas behind that. And I also think that makes sense when you're planning 3 months out. It's not reasonable to know everything you're going to do 3 months out. But the other thing we did was try to reel in our goals to be a little more objective and to basically be less aspirational, more actionable. And that will then require them to kind of dial down their ambitions a little bit. And I do think there's something lost in that. But I think, again, the pros outweigh the cons in that. So there's a lot more to unpack there that would take all day. But goals were very important to us. I don't think it's a thing we ever mastered by any means. I'm not sure anyone has. But it is valuable. I would never get rid of it. And it really does help steer the ship in a lot of ways. But there's so much we can constantly do to reevaluate and improve it.
Well, in remote first, for that visibility and that connective tissue, the idea that you are talking about the same goals all the time, you have to. And a month is not a very long period of time.
No,
so
it goes by real fast.
There's something about momentum in there that I think is a valuable rethink on goals. And I think it doesn't preclude you from having aspirations and that you may express in strategic goals or in other ways. But I think for productivity and connectedness, there's something to pace. There's something to operating cadence. There's something to that. I can see Brittany nodding. But yeah, I mean, Brittany, you were really dealing with, making this change happen. Obviously there's some tooling, so love to hear about that. But just what was the mess in getting from, introducing it to people living it?
We generally have a session to go over these things with people every time that we start it. And that's never going to cover all the bases. I think people continue to come up to me and ask me questions about, how they can set this appropriately, not only in the tool, but just how do I quantify this thing? And I work really hard with my team. Certain teams need it more than others to sort of find a way to reach that objective piece of the goal. Or that thing that really represents how they can report this versus something that's in a big, cloud of nebulous information. But I think, I just want to tag on to what Luke said. One of the things that was challenging with quarterly that I think has also been easier is sort of when goals become collaborative. I mean, we try to avoid sort of dependencies in those because they tend to be problematic, especially on a quarterly scale. But when you sort of crunch that down to a month and people are going, okay, here's what I want to achieve. Here's who I need to work with. I think that person that they're working with is also able to go, this is realistic in a month versus looking 3 months out. And I think that served us really well in terms of just being agile as a company and being able to switch our goals around and stuff like that.
And then you guys are using hypercontext to do that, so everybody's on the same platform for all of those activities, for when they're collaborating on the work and for when they're collaborating on the goals. So it's been a really cool thing to watch as you guys kind of pulled this together, because your strategy meeting the tooling all in one has been fun to work with.
2 questions I've always sort of wanted to ask about the transition to monthly. One is, how do you condense sort of this planning, collaboration, coordination, and almost communication part of the goal exercise down? In some cases, if you're talking to a normal team on a quarterly cycle, that might be 3 weeks of the quarter is the planning, coming up with and everything. How do you condense that down? And then sort of now that you can look back maybe close to 12 months into this process, how do you protect against sandbagging?
One thing I said earlier that there's a lot of granularity in sort of how you take it is that the goals don't represent everything. What's important to me is that the goals represent progress. So one of the struggles that we've had is, for example, in sales, it's very natural to put your quotas in there. But we have other ways to measure that, and they have other motivations to get that right. I don't think those, frankly, should be goals. I think goals should be about how everybody moves the company forward in some way that adds value. So we don't have typically very big goals, or if we do, we split them up. It is not uncommon to plan out your next 3 months worth of goals. And if they get ahead of them, that's fine. But because of the sort of monthly check-ins and the way we tie them to performance and reward and whatnot, in a grander scheme, they can't get behind on them. So you're not disincentivized to try to plan out what you want to do. One thing Brittany touched on that was like an aha moment when she said it a minute ago, because I can't believe I didn't say it, is dependencies are one of the biggest challenges we have in goal setting. In that, if you don't get this done, I can't get this done, and you just sort of create this house of cards. I do believe monthly has helped with that. And again, if you feel that coming, you're more likely to plan with those people ahead of time. The other thing that quarterly, going back maybe to the first question that quarterly really helps with, is in any sort of modern tech company, maybe if you're, Netflix size, it's a different story, but us, a little closer to the ground, we found that quite often when we had quarterly goals, we'd pivot off them all the time. And we'd have to change goals a lot, or we'd have to have rules for how they don't get penalized for changing something that pivoted for something above them. And when you cut the time frame down to a third, that's going to legitimately happen, a minimum of a third as many times, a third as often. So it's really good. The sandbagging, though, great question, is really the manager's entire responsibility in this program, right? Is the idea is, our team sets their own goals. We don't set your goals for you ever, either at the individual or team level. But your manager's job is to make sure that those goals add value. And they want to basically make sure of two things. One, does it add value? And by that, I mean, is it progressive for the company? And two, does it in some meaningful way align with the grand, goals of the company and going up to the top of the pyramid? So I think sandbagging, if somebody sandbags, the manager failed at that. And then it happens, we all fail from time to time, but it's not the person. Like there's a check and a balance here, and the manager is the check. The person is fully responsible for it, and therefore they're incentivized to come up with something of value so they don't get, shot down. But I would also, I'm obviously not involved in all the individual discussions, I'm more at the team level. But I think it's pretty infrequent that goals actually get shot down. I think people are typically pretty familiar with what's going to get the right attention and what really aligns with what we're trying to achieve.
That distribution of accountability for the quality of the goals is appeals to me. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot is how do we help managers be better? And a part of that is for them to be able to do more of these things. HR teams in growing software companies are not large. You do not have an army of coaches to go and review every single person's goal and make sure that it lines up. And so if you are not actively arming, the better part of your leadership staff with that accountability and that responsibility and that capability, then you're kind of shortening your ability, your own ability to execute. So I love that. That concept that maybe the shorter time frames makes it easier for you to have a larger group of people that are really pushing the needle forward. They're not all just looking for somebody else to provide the direction. They're part of that calculation. They're part of the equation to do that. And I think, Brittany, you were saying that's sort of where you spend and your team spends some time, is really helping those managers set them up to accomplish a couple things. I think you mentioned that one is the visibility, which you guys set up at the front. The other is how it kind of gets measured. And then Luke brought it up a little bit, but Brittany, this is also a whole piece of your kind of talent evaluations and reviews as well, is that goals carry kind of an importance all the way through kind of an employee's life cycle. It's how they define their work. It's how they're evaluated. It's how they participate. I feel like I just took the words from your mouth, but
it's all accurate.
Connecting them to our performance has given people a lot more investment in those goals. And I think that's where the concern of sandbagging comes in, right? I mean, when it's part of how we're going to look at their annual performance, they're that much more worried about setting a goal that they, aren't going to be able to reach. But to that point, what Luke said is exactly right. We're really putting it on our managers to make sure that their people are setting the right goals. And that's sort of how we are able to condense that process as well, right? I mean, if we had to spend as a team a whole day each month looking at everyone's goals and making sure that we're all aligned to every level, that just wouldn't be worth our time. I think our managers need to hold that, and they do, because it's what serves their team moving forward.
That's amazing. I see so many goal projects fall apart on that exact thing. I mean, one of the reasons why our product focuses on making sure that you have goals embedded right into your meeting agenda is because we know just by talking about them every week, you're going to get better. So we're very much about the put it into the level where it's going to be managed. Less concerned about or time spent on the strategy behind it. And I think, Luke, you make a good point of the pace of monthly means that you're not resetting so many times. You're generally going to have to reset goals, but if you are dealing with them in smaller chunks, the odds of them straying so far away from strategy are limited because you're...
Yeah, I believe the monthly, I've already sort of addressed it, but agility it really, really influences agility in a big way. Another thing about it, and this is just the human nature, we all multitask. The further apart you do anything, the less well you do it, in my opinion. You just kind of forget everything you learned and you have to relearn a lot of it, no matter how well documented it is. So when you build something in a more reasonable cadence, no matter what it is, it just feels easier. And you said something earlier that I don't think was extreme enough. You mentioned that, if you talk about, I would have to paraphrase you a bit, but if you talk about your goals every week, you have a better shot of achieving them. I would argue if you don't talk about them every week, you will not achieve them. It's far more extreme than just, it increases your odds. Like they will get forgotten.
It increases your chances by 95%, but
yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
It feels like you're, being...
We have a funny time with that stuff because like the science repeatedly proves, whether you're talking about physical sciences, or diet and exercise, whatever it is, right? Like, if you talk about your goals, every single week, 95% higher odds of actually accomplishing them. Then you go on a demo and you say that, and it's like, well, wait, what's this like one thing that increases the odds by 95? There's no way. The truth is, it's hard for most companies to talk about their goals every single week, right? Like
having lifted firsthand, I believe it all day long. It is very true. You need to be talking about it. Something else we do, just the way we structure our goals, and I honestly don't even know if this is sacrilege within the OKR community, but our managers don't have personal goals. They are responsible for their team. And at Centercode, success and failure sort of floats up equally. You as a manager get all the credit for everything your team does, so you shouldn't be taking credit away from any of them. It's multiplicative, and it's the same sort of thing with the goals. So they collectively kind of build goals for the team, and then the individual's job is to build goals that are going to help address those goals and then go up the hierarchy. But my managers themselves, like, Brittany doesn't have personal goals. She has HR ops goals. And so far that's worked really well for us because the last thing we need is 8,000 goals.
I have a question for you guys about this topic. If Brittany doesn't have HR goals, Brittany doesn't have personal goals, Brittany has HR goals, but she's the head of HR, is Brittany's goals just the HR goals? How do you, I know there's a difference between those, but what do you think the difference is?
I think that so first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brittany, but I do believe when we first put in OKRs, we did have individual goals for managers, and we ended up with a weird amount of redundancy, and they would often fall into the trap of putting their team goals first at the sacrifice of their own goals, and it just became tactically very, very challenging. In Brittany's case, again, small company, she has a small team compared to, say, engineering or sales. In those organizations, hers are going to be pretty well aligned, but she does have multiple people on her team. and they will contribute toward those team goals. There could be a goal, Brittany, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there could be a goal in a month that literally she's doing 100% of the work because her team is off doing other things. They will still have their own personal goals. Maybe they're progressing their education. There's a lot of different ways to approach goals, but other times she might not have any direct hand in her team's monthly goals. It might be that the HR team is, working on some event-related stuff or something else relative to their team that is the top priority right now, and she's not. I mean, she's, indirectly adjacent to it, but she's not the one achieving those things. So there is a lot of play by ear as you go on this stuff.
Yeah,
so accountable for it, but not necessarily responsible for doing it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add on to that this is like the perfect example of how goals are not one size fits all. My team is very different from, like Luke said, the engineering team. And I think giving managers sort of the ability to control those goals a little bit allows them to fit them for how they work on their team. And I think we have to allow that flexibility to some extent.
Yeah, I think you need a very, somewhat subjective but directional goals for your team. And like I said, for us, it's about progress. It's not about hitting your metrics. The metrics are things that we're already tracking. It's about how do we get ahead? How do we do something smart that makes the company better, that makes our customers' lives better, that makes our employees' lives better? It's something new. And I think that is something I'll admit we struggle with, is the distinction between metrics and these types of trackable monthly goals, because obviously we don't have the benefit of planning our annual, on a month, our annual revenue on a monthly basis. It would be amazing if I could get away with that, but the board would not approve. Or I'd be having weekly board meetings, which is maybe worse, certainly worse. So I think it is a trick to find that balance and make sure that they're all represented. But for us, it's about progress, and generally in pretty interesting and unique ways, depending on the team and the person.
Yeah, and sometimes doing your job better is progress. It's not something new. It's just
learning. I mean, that's one of my favorite things. The way I sold OKRs from day one to my team, and it was pretty positively taken from the first, was this is designed to let you carve out something that will make you better and you better at your job, and allow you to learn something new, allow you to interact with another team. It's a sanctioned way to do that you don't have to feel like you're sacrificing your day-to-day work for that, because by accepting that goal, your manager has allocated that thing that you want as part of your job. And that's a huge, huge gain for people.
So you guys have, kind of went down a path that led you to have maybe no other choice than remote first, although I would argue lots of people went down that same road and have made a different choice. But you went to that remote first. On reflection, can you evaluate the effectiveness of that? Is that it? Can you even look at it as an isolated choice to be made that had specific benefits, or is it now just all kind of rolled together that we were down that path, so we were doing it anyway, so it's not something we can compare?
I would argue we can't compare it, but I do want to unpack that. I would argue that it's very difficult as a sort of agile-minded company to compare any 2 years. I mean, you've got the economy, you've got there's so many things that my biggest argument I've said as a CEO over the years is I just have no control. And by control, I mean in a scientific method way. We had a great year this year. Okay, next year we have a crappy year, but the economy changed. We can't measure them anymore because something outside our control changed. So looking at this, which has now spanned, 3.5 years, is very hard to determine. There are incredibly obvious, inarguable benefits, right? The fact that I can go down and see my wife after this meeting and go to lunch with her is something I just wouldn't have had a reasonable capability to do, and it's had a very positive impact on my life, and many of my, if not most of my people have the same. So that stuff is very positive. I will point out, it was very much a choice for us eventually. We had our office up until recently, and by that I mean we had an office that I was spending around $45,000 a month for nearly 3 years after not using it due to a very, very unfortunate lease. So at any given point, it actually would have been relatively easy for us to just say, hey, all those desks and computers are still there. We can all go back. We can do this. Or we can do the hybrid thing, which is a whole other fun topic. But we could have done that in a heartbeat. It's arguable whether or not I would have had retention issues. It's arguable if some people would have appreciated that more. I mean, that's all doesn't matter. It's in the past. But we did have the choice. And given the two, we did very deliberately decide that while COVID let the genie out of the bottle, all things being equal, the pros of this outweigh the cons. And I do think that's kind of an important thing about our perspective is I don't feel like our hand was forced in the long term. I think we really did eventually come to the conclusion that given that we're a technology company who can lean on technology to make this type of situation better, that we made the best choice for the company, understanding very, very importantly that the happiness and the engagement of our team is a big part of that. And without that, we can't succeed. So, that's not just CEO speak. It is tactical. It's logical. We need people. It's a competitive market. We need people that want to work here.
I was going to say your recruiting story alone. Like, I think that's a lot of people talk about the opportunity for talent. And
I will tell you, as a CEO, I wish every other CEO would require their teams to go back to work.
Yeah, that's right.
I would have my pick of the litter all day long. In fact, the more companies that go this route, ironically, the worse it is for me personally. Because it really is an amazing thing to be able to kind of have this work-life balance if you're an employee, myself included.
And we spent deliberately a bunch of time on talking about collaboration and sort of pace or that sort of productivity. Are there gains in how those things work because you chose to go remote first? Are there things that either practices or tools or otherwise that you've adopted that I think you sort of made the case that your collaboration wasn't perfect beforehand, having to be intentional about it because you were remote improved a lot more than that? Are there other things that you might point to that deliberate choice has now given you a new muscle or a better exercised muscle around some of those other practices that now help you propel the company forward?
I think that one of the things that came out pretty quickly when we started being remote and became more difficult as we had more people doing this regularly is we really had to learn to communicate our availability, and that's a skill that we didn't have before.
Okay.
I can't say that like it replaces being able to walk over to a person and, have that conversation just because they're in the office. But it is a skill that helps you sort of plan your collaboration with people in a different way. That
some intentionality around collaboration. So where you were collaborative by nature of co-location and just the kind of work you do and the culture you had when in office, as soon as that net of the office went away, now you had to think differently about intentional collaboration.
Brittany's got a way better memory than I do, because that was like one of the first things we put a lot of energy into. But now, again, we're talking 3 years ago, was we have always very, very deliberately had that sort of, not unique to us, but we don't care when people show up. We don't care if they, need to go to an appointment. We don't as long as you kind of, if it's on your calendar, show up. It was all very, very casual. But you could also just see someone at their desk and know if they're there or not. Whereas if you're waiting for someone and you message them on Slack and they did that thing without saying anything, it just creates new hurdles. And I actually completely forgot, honestly, because I think it's gotten so much better, that was a big problem early on. Is it was very hard to kind of have that cake and eat it too, of that sort of absolute freedom. And now it's pretty simple in that, we use Slack like many, and we're just very deliberate in kind of our policies of like, hey, if you're literally going to be away from your keyboard for a while, throw it in this channel. And if you don't respond to someone within X minutes, they're going to look in that channel and say, oh, they're not available. Okay, I'm going to move on. Little things like that. Yeah, they're so day-to-day now. I completely forgot they were at one point a challenge. I will say one of the things that we benefit from, and most companies in tech, I think, thankfully do as well, is we already use tools that luckily we're very collaborative and just if you imagine what would have happened had COVID happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it would have been a different animal. I mean, we live in Google Docs, we live in a shared calendar, we live in, Slack. Those three tools alone probably got us through the first month, right? Whereas we would have been on a month-long furlough as a company had those three things not existed and already been innate to our life. I don't remember exactly when we brought in hypercontext, but it was sort of the next of those. Like it kind of helped on the meeting side of how we track that information and where we go from there. But without those tools, without this sort of modern kind of async and synced conversation, we'd have been screwed like all day. So I think we really lucked out with some of that. I do believe availability in this virtual environment was key. I will admit, no, I don't mean foul to them, but we did try and play with the virtual office solutions where everybody's sitting, an icon at a desk and an avatar. And, we would be entertained by it for half an hour like it was a video game. And then we would realize that it's skeuomorphic. It's like it doesn't actually add any benefit. It's just cute. And unfortunately, we didn't, unfortunately for those companies anyway, we didn't stick to any of those. But we did, really double down on how we approach Slack, because Slack just became our primary means of communication. We really doubled down on all of that stuff to try to keep it reasonable and fair and productive. And I think we did. I don't think anyone's complaining about it. I think it's gone pretty well.
Well, and that intentionality maybe is a theme that we talk about a lot. So intentionality with meetings, like hypercontext would have been that for you guys. I think, like you shared, one of your favorite features is just canceling a meeting if there's no agenda, or if you can answer it asynchronously. So that I feel a thread of intentionality coming through you, intentionality on collaboration around goals, or just in general to be organized and needs to be purposeful and probably goal driven. So you're showing up with a plan in mind, I think is what I'm sort of hearing. I don't know, Brittany, if you would say that differently. Have you introduced any new ways of measuring either your culture or your productivity because of this, because now it's maybe easier to see that intentionality? Or are you asking different questions of your team that are maybe instructive for other people that are looking at remote first and trying to get better at it? I know, Brittany, you sort of I know in your review cycle, you started asking a question you hadn't before, but are there other things that you've kind of learned that you need to do or you have to do? Awareness of your availability was one thing. Are there others?
So I think I'm so worried for needless reasons of coming off as cliche with a lot of this or not necessarily authentic in what I'm trying to say, but you do have to trust your team more. Mm-hmm. Like, and that is tricky. And I think certain roles are much more concerning than others. And I struggle with how to say this out loud, but I think experience plays a heavy part.
Yep.
And by that, I mean, there are certain roles that are innately younger, newer to tech, newer to the professional lifestyle, things like SDRs. SDR is a role that most people do sort of early into a sales career. And it's a role that I don't think plays well with a lot of agency. I think it's a role that needs a lot of metrics behind it. I think it literally, that sort of classic bullpen makes sense. And it's not just to watch over and make sure they're working. It's to coach them in real time, to listen to them. That's a role that, frankly, we abandoned. We don't have anymore for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest was I just didn't think it worked well in this environment. And there's only a handful of roles that really play into that. And thankfully, I know that, on-site companies aren't going away. As I said, I wished a lot more companies were them. But I would argue that if you're going to go into that career, you should start in an on-site, get your experience, get your coaching, because it's going to be valuable to you, and then go look for a company like ours. Because we went so extreme as to realize that, you have to choose your battles as a small company. It's just sort of something we do every day. And that wasn't a battle I felt capable of winning. And I felt I needed a different strategy because I did feel that role needed something that we couldn't provide in our organization. So there is kind of a balance there.
But it happened to marry up with the just plummeting efficiency of outbound as a tactic.
I did say it wasn't the only reason.
I can't remember. I was trying to look for the stat before I got here, but the sort of increase in the number of touches required for
it's that. It's also we know we're in an economy that's challenging.
Yeah.
So you run into a situation where young inexperienced person in a market that's shifting, in an economy that's challenging, you don't even know who or what to blame at that point. It's just a losing battle.
Yeah.
And, my job as CEO is to win no matter what. So if I come to the conclusion that that is a lost battle and I need to choose my battles, I just need a different solution. And my argument there is that one, for lots of reasons, some internal, some external forces, just isn't compatible with this, at least for us, this style of work. And coming to that conclusion and then forcing yourself to come to an alternative that will still allow you to succeed as a company and as a CEO is important and just needs to be prioritized.
There's an interesting conversation. I think you're a member of Pavilion as well, but there's a sort of an interesting string of conversation in those circles or in amongst those people around sort of the end of a particular era of SaaS, where you can't actually look at the previous benchmarks of a go-to-market strategy and assume anything. And I think it's interesting to me that we're seeing people for the first time deal with those kinds of major management challenges. You guys put a lot of accountability on your managers, which I actually love to see. And I think more companies would benefit greatly from recognizing that that's a huge part of your potential success and your productivity and your leverage is in your managers. But going through like a major change in your go-to-market strategy, or just it could have been your product strategy. It was your product strategy too. Is there something about remote first also that you had to even do that differently? Is the way that you manage or the way you think about managers or the way you think about how you organized also been impacted? And are you also had to make major changes in that to be able to support these external forces? We're all dealing with the macro environment, economic macro environment that's, made us all had to rethink our playbooks. Sort of a lot of playbooks just kind of got thrown out and you're having to reimagine them. Did the remote almost prepare you for having to do that? So now
I've always hated playbooks.
Yeah.
Just as an idea, I think it discounts the idea that there are things that make every company and product and customer and team different. And anytime you try, and I often, it's a weird thing because I believe this and I operate by it, but I also believe to some extent I must be wrong because it is so prolific. But, every time I've hired a highly experienced leader who came in with a playbook mindset, they failed miserably. And it's just, they didn't take the time to learn our business or to learn the context of our go-to-market and our customer. They just tried to apply something that they believed worked, something that they were taught that worked, and it failed every time for reasons that to me were obvious, but I even made the core mistake of, and it's a slippery slope, but I made the core mistake of just trusting them, of recognizing that, hey, I'm paying them this much for this experience. They've done it before. They know something I don't. I'm not a marketing-driven CEO. I'm not a sales-driven CEO, so they know something. And I think the key point here is I thought playbooks were dangerous before we all went remote. I think they're really dangerous now because they probably don't account for it. Now, 5-10 years from now, when we have lots of remote back end to us or, behind us, maybe it's a different story. But, much in the same way I've been telling my entire team, like, hey, guys, I love AI. It's exciting as hell, but there's no such thing as a mature AI product, and we need to keep that in mind. I think we're in the same sort of perspective with how we run a business in remote. This is not something anybody has truly solved. And even if I said I solved it, and I'm really proud of that, what I'm really saying is I solved it for me, not you. And anybody that says they solved it for everybody is, a guru charlatan, and it's not real. So I do think you kind of have to pay attention to context, and that is so critical.
I think the string that you pulled through a lot of this is just agility. You talked about having an agile organization from the outset. So that has just, one, allowed you to accommodate change. And if that's the mentality you've always had, then that's how you're dealing with change as it comes.
Well, we've always had an attitude at Centercode that, within a pretty degree of reason, it's okay to make any mistake, just don't make it twice. That's always been our thought, and you're not going to get punished for making a bad call. I say within reason because obviously we still have to, be ethical and moral and, protect privacy and blah, blah, blah. But, the average sort of, most decisions aren't one-way doors, and people need to be willing to try different things. What's been tricky for us more recently is I think people, good on them, took that to heart and said, okay, it's okay to make a mistake. But the funny thing is everything is kind of different now, and people are afraid to try something they tried 2 years ago because it didn't work, but they're not realizing that it's actually a different thing now, and it might succeed because parameters have changed, the world's changed, and it might fail even though those things have changed. But we can't hesitate every once in a while to bring it out and say, okay, has the context shifted? If the context shifted, what has changed that might make this work this time? And as long as they're willing to bring that into the conversation, we can get real creative. And that, for example, has been a big deal in our marketing recently is, we often feel like in marketing plays, we've kind of had the Simpsons did it attitude of like, we've tried everything. Some things have worked, some didn't, but I'm trying to remind my team like, hey, that thing that didn't work, that was like 6 years ago when the entire world was different. What's different? Let's talk about that. And maybe it makes sense to do it again. That's been really important to us this year, just accepting that the world is different.
Yeah. And maybe we're all developing the muscle because we've had to. Yeah. And maybe that sort of diving into a remote first was the first of a series of big experiments around throwing out everything and starting again. It's sort of a perpetual learning cycle that we're now just more used to.
We definitely embrace change for the better and try change and see if it works. And I think to answer your sort of previous question, I think one of the ways that we try to navigate that is by getting a pulse from our people. And sometimes that's in the form of like a survey, but a lot of times it's just people saying this thing isn't working, or us trying new things and hearing that from them. And I think, we're not hesitant to change things based on them saying it's not working. And we're very transparent about those changes.
I have observed that sort of attitude of you'll take the feedback and you're not, it's not a personal affront, it's an opportunity to grow. Like that's been one of the fun things of working with you guys is that if it doesn't work, we'll try the next thing. It's a gift as an organization to think that way, for sure. Yeah. I would, on that note then, Brittany, I'd love to hear, we do definitely want to talk a little bit about hypercontext in that vein. And I think, Brittany, you've certainly been my partner in crime as we've gone through the many things in this, and a great partner to have as we have worked with it. If you are to look at some of the opportunities that the tool has given you, are there things that you can share about how it's either improved a process or given you an opportunity to rethink maybe on that vein of that?
Well, certainly, we've talked about goals back and forth, but I think we really rethought a lot about our review process as we were sort of exploring the new tools that are available to us there, resulting in us sort of condensing things that used to be many, many processes that took people a lot of time. And for example, we used to go into job duties and dig into those very deeply and have people talk about every single little thing. And now we just kind of give them one place to say all of that. And I think at first our people were like, what is this? Why can I not say all the things that I said before? But I think we found that we got the information that we needed, in general, that they felt heard. And along with a theme that we've touched on a couple of times, I think similar to how we are agile in the business, I think we're agile with people's roles. We have people who, their role became less relevant, so they shifted to somewhere else, or something else in the business became a priority, and they were happy to move over and step into that. And so giving them some flexibility to say, I know this is what I was doing, but here's what I'm doing for the company now. And, judge me on this. And I think it's really important to give that space. And we did it with less space. So I think we embraced some change there. Definitely, tried some new questions that give us both the manager perspective and an employee perspective. That was something brand new for us. And super interesting to get, the comparison of those things, where before I think we kind of took a narrative and, had a manager do a more assessment style thing. So
you had more detail but less perspectives before, and now you're maybe, asking less specifics but getting more context in the way that you've structured it. Yeah, no, I love the way that you will see that something's different and then be like, okay, well then how would I do it differently? It's never a barrier for you. It's something I appreciate about your culture in general, is that you run into something, it's not a wall. It's like maybe just an opportunity to rethink at something, and that's super fun to work with. Luke, are there anything else in the hyper context experience, things that you think have provided a positive change or an opportunity for you that you didn't anticipate, or that is not maybe obvious?
Yes. And I think if I were to kind of break it up into both sides, sort of the meeting stuff and the performance stuff, and the meeting stuff I have used a heck of a lot more because I use it every week and generally every day. The adoption of that was a lot easier than I thought it would be. Getting new tools adopted can be an absolute nightmare. It's incredibly rare that people just immediately have an aha moment. And that was one that, for the most part, you've always got a few people that just don't prioritize it because that's who they are. But the vast majority immediately jumped in. And for me, that sort of log of information is so critical. It's why it was such a non-brainer for me. I again mentioned, I think maybe before we started recording briefly, that I'm very much like, I forget everything instantly, but if I see any little hint of it, it all comes rushing back. And to me, that is what hypercontext has been very often. That then transferring over to the review process is the single biggest thing. I have hated giving performance reviews more than almost any part of my job for my entire career. And it's a weird thing. It's not that I hate the bureaucracy. It's not that I don't think it's valuable. I think it's immensely valuable. And keep in mind, I'm the one who forced it to happen. So, despite hating it, I see the value, but I never felt like I did a good job at it, which is why I hate it. And it's very easy to dislike anything you don't think you're good at. But I always felt like I should have so many more insightful things to say right now at this point in time. I should have so much more context, but I just don't remember it all. And especially if, in my case, I'm doing it for 8 directors or VPs that have they have nothing in common in terms of what they do day to day. One runs sales, one runs engineering. Like, there's very little that they produce as a team that overlaps. And the idea of getting that surfaced so that I actually remembered, oh, this and this and this, and oh, that at the time I thought they could have done differently, but I was too busy to say anything. Now I can sort of add that insight and actually have something of value to add, because as I said, when I say I'm not good at it, what I'm really saying is I never felt like I added them any value. I felt like I was just judging them, and that's not really in my DNA. That's not what I seek to do. So I was always disappointed when all I could do was judge them, unless it's a perfect score, in which case everybody walks away happy. But, for anything else, if it's less than perfect, I want to tell them how we can help them. Something else we did that I don't know how contextually relevant it is, but it's one of my favorite things about sort of how we think of people, and is basically in our team, there's numerous scores like every performance system ever, but our top score, we basically deliberately said, we can't tell you how to get it. It's sort of your job to surprise us. And what we're really saying is it's not expected of you. Like, we are perfectly happy if you are below that, and you will get, the reward coming to you or whatever the incentive is. But, and what that did is allow us to give a nice benchmark to tell our team, to tell my team, my managers, when sort of measuring people's performance is like, look, if they're doing terrible for some reason, you should be able to tell them exactly what you need. If they're doing good, but could be better, you should be capable of brainstorming for how them to be better. But there is something above your creativity that if they want to go out of their way to surprise you, I shouldn't just, again, the way the language works, I shouldn't be able to tell you how to surprise me. That would ruin the surprise. So we kind of built it around that, and that being captured in here has been very valuable and useful to me.
I love that. You can't dictate how to achieve the top score because it's beyond your imagination.
Yeah.
And it's going to come, and it's going to be, it's going to be
time people do it. Every time people do it, right? And it's fun for everyone.
No, it's true. Some themes in all of that really was that flexibility and agility all through that there is no box you can put a person in, that their creativity and their contribution is going to be contextually relevant to what's going on in the business at the time. And it's also going to be whatever they can come up with. And you can't possibly imagine the scope and the extent to which they can contribute to your business. It's going to far outpace your expectations, which is amazing.